What if I told you that the history books you studied in school were redacted? Not just edited for brevity, but surgically altered to remove a chapter so dark, so fundamentally disturbing, that the United States government didn't just classify it, they tried to erase it from human memory. We are taught that World War II was won by industrial might, by the atomic bomb, by the bravery of the GI, on the beaches of Normandy and the islands of the Pacific. And this is true, but it is not the whole truth. There was another war, a war fought not for territory, but for the human mind. A war where the weapons were not rifles or tanks, but primal terror and ancient psychological triggers weaponized by modern science. Before we open the vaults that were sealed at Fort Huachuca, Andrews Air Force Base, and the deep archives of the National Archives Annex in Kansas City, I need you to do something. This story is actively being suppressed by the algorithm. It deals with topics that make the establishment uncomfortable. So, hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. Help us keep these stories alive before they are scrubbed forever. Comment below, "I am watching," so we know you are here. Now let us go back to December 8, 1941, 23 hours after the Japanese fleet decimated the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The United States was in a state of catastrophic panic. The West Coast was defenseless. The military leadership knew that conventional mobilization would take months' time they did not have. In the corridors of the War Department, a shadow committee was formed. Their mandate was simple: find an asymmetric advantage. Find a way to strike fear into an enemy that was currently invincible. It was in this atmosphere of existential dread that a courier arrived at the San Carlos Apache Indian Reservation in southeastern Arizona. The vehicle was an unmarked Army sedan, kicking up a trail of dust that hung in the stagnant air for miles. The courier carried a telegram, standard War Department issue, printed on cheap yellow paper, but the contents were unprecedented. It did not ask for volunteers. It did not ask for laborers. It requested the immediate, clandestine presence of the tribal council elders at Fort Huachuca for a matter described only as national security and cultural preservation. By nightfall, 12 Apache elders had made the journey through the Sonoran Desert. These were men who remembered the old wars. Some of them had been children when Geronimo surrendered in 1886. They carried the cultural memory of a time when the Apache were the undisputed masters of guerrilla warfare in the Southwest. They were escorted into a sub-basement conference room in Building 5101. The room was windowless, the air stale and smelling of stale tobacco and nervous sweat. The concrete walls were bare, save for a single map of the Pacific Theater, marked with red zones of Japanese control. Seated across from the elders were 3 men. Their uniforms were pristine, but stripped of all rank insignia and name tags. The man in the center, the one the Apaches would later refer to only as the Colonel, looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week. His eyes were hard, flinty, but deep within them there was a flicker of something rare in military men: fear. The Colonel placed a leather folder on the steel table. He didn't open it. He let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating, before he spoke. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice low, betraying a tremor that suggested he knew he was crossing a moral event horizon. "We are about to ask you to help us win a war using methods that will never be acknowledged by this government or any other. What we discuss tonight is classified at levels that exceed our nuclear program. If you agree to what we propose, you will be training men to become something the world has not seen since your ancestors fought in these very mountains. You will be creating ghosts." The room went deadly silent. The air conditioning hummed, a mechanical intrusion on a moment of ancient weight. The tribal chairman, Joseph Tizos, was a man carved from the desert itself. His face was a map of lines and weathered skin, his eyes dark pools that had seen the end of one world and the uncomfortable birth of another. He studied the Colonel. He didn't look at the folder. He looked at the man's soul. When Tizos finally spoke, His voice was like grinding stones. This response comes from a single declassified transcript fragment recovered in 2014, misfiled in a box of meteorological reports. Our grandfathers knew how to make an enemy afraid of the dark. They knew that a man who fears the night cannot fight when the sun rises. If you want us to teach your soldiers that art, you must understand it comes with a cost. You are asking for the ghost dance of war. Once a man learns to move like the wind and kill like the mountain lion, he does not easily return to being a man who sleeps peacefully. You are asking us to awaken something that we put to sleep for a reason. The colonel nodded slowly. We are prepared to pay that cost, Chairman. The question is that can you teach it? Tissos leaned forward. We can teach it, but you cannot control it. The agreement was struck. What the military was proposing went far beyond the famous Navajo code talkers. The code talkers were a communications asset. This was a weaponization of culture. The initiative was never given an official name in the logs. Researchers call it the Shadow War Initiative. Construction began immediately, not on the main base of Fort Huachuca, but 30 miles northeast, in a jagged, isolated box canyon that had once been prime Apache hunting grounds. The location was deliberate. The geography was essential. The acoustics of the canyon, the way the wind howled through the rocks at night, it was chosen to break the recruits down before the training even began. By January 1942, the facility was operational. It consisted of 12 barracks, a mess hall, and a series of conditioning bunkers dug into the canyon walls. There were no fences to keep people out. The terrain did that. There were fences to keep the trainees in. 147 men reported for the first cycle. They were a mix, some Apache, some Navajo, some Hopi, and a handful of white soldiers who had grown up on the reservations or were hunters from the deep Appalachians. They were handpicked for their psychological profiles, high resilience, low empathy scores, and a history of solitary behavior. Only 63 would complete the training. The fate of the other 84 is a black hole in the records. Their families received standard telegrams, transferred to classified assignment, missing in transit, non-combat fatality. No bodies were returned, no explanations given. They simply ceased to exist. The training that took place in that canyon from January to June 1942 was a synthesis of ancient Apache stealth tactics and cutting-edge behavioral psychology. The recruits learned to move through dry brush without snapping a twig. They learned to regulate their heart rates to near hibernation levels to remain motionless for days. They learned to navigate by the smell of the wind and the feel of the barometric pressure. But that was just the physical side. The psychological conditioning was where the shadow war truly began. The instructors, the Apache elders, and a team of military psychologists taught the men how to project presence, how to make an enemy feel watched. They utilized what the elders called the fear walk, a journal entry from Lieutenant Robert Chun, one of only 3 non-Apache officers allowed to observe the training, provides a chilling window into this process. Chun was a pragmatic man, a logistics officer, but his journal, found in a locked safe box after his death in 1998, reveals a man whose worldview was shattering. His entry from March 14, 1942 goes, "Today I watched something that made me question whether we are the good guys in this war, or if there are any good guys left." The instructors demonstrated the fear walk to the recruits. It involves stalking an enemy position for hours, sometimes days. You don't attack. You don't shoot. You leave signs. You move objects in their camp. While they sleep, a canteen moved 3 inches to the left. A photograph turned face down. You create marks on the trees that suggest something inhuman has passed through. You use acoustic mimicry to create sounds that the human brain cannot quite identify. Sound that sits right in the uncanny valley between animal and human scream. By the time you actually engage, the enemy is already psychologically defeated. Their cortisol levels are spiked. They haven't slept. They are fighting ghosts, and ghosts cannot be killed. I asked Sergeant Chino, one of the Apache liaisons, if he worried about what happens to our men when they return home after learning these techniques. He looked at me with eyes that seemed far older than his 24 years. He said, "They won't all return, Lieutenant. And the ones who do, they will not be the same men who left. You cannot become a ghost and then expect to live among the living." I am beginning to understand what he meant. The men in Barracks 4 have stopped speaking English to each other. They communicate in hand signals and a series of clicks. Even when they are off duty, they sit in the dark, staring at the walls. They are shedding their humanity like a snake sheds its skin. As the weeks progressed, the training escalated into the realm of the experimental. The military brought in scientists from the Office of Scientific Research and Development, OSRD. They were testing early versions of acoustic devices prototypes that generated subsonic frequencies known to induce feelings of dread, nausea, and paranoia in human subjects. The Apache trainees were taught to use these devices in conjunction with traditional death whistles, carved bone instruments that emitted a sound like a human shriek. The combination was devastating. They were also introduced to chemical warfare on a microscale. Compound X13, a hallucinogenic agent absorbed through the skin, was developed to be applied to surfaces an enemy might touch door handles, weapon stocks, water canteens. It didn't kill. It induced low-grade visual hallucinations and a heightened state of suggestibility. Imagine the synergy. A Japanese sentry, sleep-deprived, dosed with a mild hallucinogen, hearing subsonic frequencies that make his chest vibrate with dread, and then hearing the shriek of a death whistle from the darkness. He sees a shadow move a shadow that shouldn't be there. This was the doctrine of the Shadow War Initiative, to break the enemy's mind so completely that his body simply gives up. By June 1942, the first class was ready. They were named Unit 0, 12 men. Their destination, the Philippines. Their mission, to turn the jungle against the Japanese Imperial Army, to prove that the supernatural could be manufactured. June 1942. The world is burning. The Japanese Imperial Army is the apex predator of the Pacific. They have swept through Malaya, Singapore, and the Philippines with a speed and ferocity that has shattered the myth of Western superiority. They are disciplined, they are fearless, and they are victorious. But on the island of Mindanao, in the southern Philippines, something is about to change. 12 men from Unit 0 are inserted via submarine, the USS Narwhal, under the cover of a moonless night. They carry no standard issue kit, no dog tags, no letters from home. They are armed with modified suppressed grease guns, traditional obsidian knives, and a series of sealed canisters marked with the insignia of the OSRD, the Office of Scientific Research and Development. They dissolve into the jungle. And for the next 3 weeks, the war in this sector stops being a conflict of armies and becomes a ghost story. To understand what happened, we must look through the eyes of the enemy. Lieutenant Yamamoto Kenji was not a superstitious peasant conscript. He was a graduate of the Imperial Army Academy, a man of logic, strategy, and ruthless efficiency. He did not believe in spirits. He believed in steel and the Emperor. But by August 1942, Yamamoto Kenji was a man dismantling his own sanity, page by page. Let's look at the entry from July 24, 1942. The jungle is suffocating. It breathes. My men are on edge. Not because of the enemy. We have seen no Americans, no Filipino guerrillas for weeks. It is the silence. 3 nights ago, Private Sato swore he saw a tree move. Not a branch in the wind, but the tree itself shifting its position. I disciplined him for spreading fear. But last night, I woke up to find my pistol had been moved. I slept with it under my pillow. When I woke, it was placed neatly in the center of the tent floor, disassembled. The spring, the slide, the magazine laid out in a perfect row. The sentries saw nothing. heard nothing. Who does this? Why did they not kill me? It is a mockery. Stop and think about the psychological precision of that act. An American GI would have slit the lieutenant's throat. It's efficient. It removes a command asset. But the Apache doctrine, refined by the shadow war psychologists, argued that a dead officer is replaced. A terrified officer, one who questions his own reality, spreads a contagion of fear that paralyzes the entire unit. This is the fear walk in practice. The shadow warriors weren't trying to kill Yamamoto yet. They were hunting his mind. They were using the jungle's natural acoustics against the Japanese. The canyon training at Fort Huachuca had taught them how to mimic the distress calls of local fauna, but pitched slightly wrong, creating an uncanny valley effect in sound. August 3, 1942. The breaking point. Yamamoto's handwriting in the diary becomes jagged, erratic. The ink is blotched with sweat or perhaps tears. We found Sergeant Nakamura at dawn. He was our strongest soldier, a veteran of China. He was found hanging from a banyan tree, 20 meters from the perimeter. His throat had been cut, but there was no blood. None on his uniform. None on the ground. It was as if he had been drained dry before he was hung there. And the markings, carved into the bark of the tree all around him, were symbols, spirals, jagged lines. Corporal Tanaka, who grew up in a rural village in Hokkaido, began to weep when he saw them. He said they looked like the seals of the Yurei, the hungry ghosts. The men are refusing to patrol. They say the forest has teeth. The lack of blood wasn't magic. It was chemistry. The Apache operatives used a cauterizing paste derived from traditional medicinal plants, mixed with a coagulant developed by the OSRD. It sealed the wound instantly. The goal was to create a clean kill, something that looked unnatural. In war, gore is normal. Cleanliness is terrifying. And those symbols? They weren't Japanese folklore. They were Apache Gan iconography symbols associated with the mountain spirits, guardians who protect the people from enemies. To the Japanese soldiers, isolated and exhausted, they projected a universal primal menace. But the physical kills were just the finale. The prelude was the whisper. We now know, thanks to the declassified manifest of the mission, that Unit Zero deployed experimental acoustic devices. These were hand-cranked sirens, modified to emit sound waves below 20 hertz. Infrasound. You can't hear infrasound, but you can feel it. It vibrates the fluid in your eyes, causing peripheral hallucinations, ghostly shapes that vanish when you look directly at them. It resonates in the chest cavity, triggering an instinctive fight or flight response. It induces nausea and a feeling of profound, unshakable doom. Imagine being in that camp. It's pitch black. You are vibrating with fear for no reason you can explain. You see shadows darting in the corner of your vision. And then, from the darkness, you hear a sound that shouldn't exist. August 5th, 1942. They are not human. I am writing this so that High Command knows we did not fail in our duty. We were not defeated by soldiers. We were consumed. Last night, the screaming started. It was not a man. It sounded like a woman, or a bird, or something in between. It came from everywhere at once. Private Ito began firing his machine gun into the darkness. He screamed that they were crawling on the ground, that they had no faces. He fired until the barrel melted. When we reached him, he was dead. His heart had simply stopped. There was not a mark on him. By morning, 6 more men were dead in their sleep. Their eyes were wide open. They died looking at something that terrified them to death. We found no footprints. We found no disturbances in the leaf litter. We are fighting smoke. I have ordered a retreat, but I do not think we will be allowed to leave. Lieutenant Yamamoto was right. They were not allowed to leave. The screaming he described was the Aztec death whistle, an ancient instrument adopted by the Apache program for its sheer psychological impact. When blown by a master, It sounds exactly like a human being screaming in mortal agony. Now, combine that with the infrasound devices disorienting the inner ear. The Japanese soldiers weren't just hearing a noise. Their brains were processing a nightmare as reality. And the faceless crawlers? This brings us to Compound X-13. Developed at the Edgewood Arsenal, X-13 was a transdermal deliriant. The Apache operatives coated the vegetation around the Japanese camp with it. As the Japanese soldiers pushed through the brush on patrol, the chemical was absorbed through their skin. Within an hour, they would experience paranoia, auditory hallucinations, and a distortion of visual processing that made human faces appear blank or melted. The shadow warriors didn't just hide in the dark. They became the dark. They moved through the camp while the enemy was drugged and disoriented, rearranging reality, whispering suggestions, and delivering precise, silent death to key targets. Of the 120 men in Yamamoto's company, only 3 survived to reach the coast. They were found wandering the beach, catatonic, babbling about the silent ones. When American forces eventually retook Mindanao in 1945, intelligence officers recovered Yamamoto's diary. They also found the site of the camp. A classified after-action report by Captain Lewis, 4th Marines, noted, "The jungle has reclaimed the vehicles, but the bodies were left. Skeletal remains still in their bedrolls. No signs of bullet impacts. No shrapnel damage. It looks like they just laid down and died. The locals won't go near the place. They call it the place where the wind eats men. I recommend we bulldoze the site and burn it. There is nothing of intelligence value here, only bad juju." But back in Washington, the Shadow War architects were celebrating. The experiment was a success. They had proven that 12 men, armed with culture, chemistry, and psychology, could dismantle a company of over 100. But they had also learned something else, something that scared them. The extraction report for Unit 0 noted that the Apache operatives were not different. They refused to debrief in English. They refused to sleep indoors. One operative, known only as Corporal Red Moon, had to be sedated because he kept trying to hunt the medical staff on the submarine. The colonel back at Fort Huachuca read the report and made a decision that would seal the fate of hundreds of men. He didn't shut the program down. He expanded it. He looked at the effectiveness of the horror they had unleashed and said, "Do it again. But this time, make it bigger." December 1944. The European Theater. The Battle of the Bulge. We are leaving the sweltering heat of the Philippines and entering the frozen hell of the Ardennes forest. This was Hitler's last gamble, a massive counteroffensive designed to split the Allied lines. History tells us this battle was won by the resilience of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne and the brute force of Patton's 3rd Army. But in the deep sectors, in the dense pine forests where the fog never lifted, a different kind of war was taking place. The Apache shadow units had been redeployed. They traded the jungle for the snow, but their doctrine remained the same. The environment is the weapon. On December 21st, a German battle group known as Kampfrupp Richter was holding a defensive line near the Belgian border. They were veterans, men who had survived the Russian front. They were dug in, they had armor support, and they were disciplined. But within 48 hours, that discipline would be obliterated. We have access to a letter intercepted by Allied intelligence, written by the unit's commander, Oberleutnant Hans Richter, to his wife in Munich. It was never mailed. It was found on him after his surrender. The letter goes, "Marta, I do not think I will see you again. We are being hunted by something that defies explanation. The Americans, they usually fight with noise. Artillery, tanks, airplanes. You always know they are coming. But these new ones, they are silence itself. Every night, more men disappear. We do not hear a shot. We do not hear a struggle. We just find them days later, if we find them at all. They are always found in places that should have been impossible to reach without us seeing or hearing, high up in the trees, or laid out in the snow in the middle of a minefield we laid ourselves. The Americans have unleashed something from the old world, something that remembers when warfare was not about machines, but about breaking the spirit before breaking the body. Our officers tell us to hold the line, but there is no line. There is only the forest and the things that move within it. Last night I saw one of them, just a glimpse in the moonlight. He was not wearing white camouflage like a soldier. He was covered in patterns that broke up his human shape. He looked at me, and I felt my courage drain away like water from a cracked cup. I know now why our men are deserting. It is not cowardice. It is survival instinct. Some things are not meant to be fought. 3 days after writing that letter, Kampfrupp Richter did something unprecedented in the history of the Wehrmacht. An entire battalion, fully armed with operational tanks, walked out of the forest and surrendered to a bewildered American logistics unit. They didn't surrender because they were out of ammunition. They didn't surrender because they were starving. They surrendered because they were terrified of the dark. When American intelligence officers interrogated the German prisoners, the stories were consistent and impossible. They spoke of the ghost soldiers who could walk through minefields without detonating them. They spoke of finding their sentries frozen to death, not from the cold, but standing upright, eyes wide open, with no visible wounds, as if their hearts had simply stopped from shock. But the most disturbing detail came from the autopsy reports of the German casualties found in that sector. Medical examiners noted that many of the German dead had high concentrations of a strange non-native alkaloid in their systems. It wasn't a standard poison. It was a derivative of datura, a plant sacred to the Apache, used in vision quests to induce altered states of reality. The shadow warriors had been infiltrating the German food supplies, not to kill them, but to dose them, to lower their psychological defenses, to make them susceptible to suggestion. So when the Apache operatives began their fear walk in the snow using the whistles, the infrasound, the projected presence, the Germans weren't just fighting an enemy. They were fighting their own chemically induced nightmares. This operation in the Ardennes proved that the techniques developed in the Arizona desert were universal. Primal fear translates into every language. But as the war in Europe ground to a halt, the High Command turned its eyes back to the Pacific. They needed the ghosts for one final apocalyptic mission. They were sending them to the island of Okinawa. And it was there, in the caves and tunnels of the Japanese defense network, that the Shadow Warrior program would descend into true madness. May 1945, Okinawa, the typhoon of steel. While the Marines were fighting, for every inch of blood-soaked mud on the surface, a different war was happening underneath the island. The Japanese had constructed miles of tunnels, a subterranean fortress designed to bleed the American forces dry. Conventional clearing methods, flamethrowers and satchel charges, were effective, but slow. Command needed something faster. They deployed the shadow units into the dark. This is where the program crossed the line from military strategy into something unrecognizable. In the jungle or the forest, you have space to retreat. In the tunnels, you are sharing the same stagnant air as your fear. We have a declassified after-action report from a Marine lieutenant, dated May 12, 1945. His platoon was tasked with securing a cave complex near the Shuri line. They expected heavy resistance. They found a tomb. We advanced into the cave system. Instead of enemy fire, we found silence. We found approximately 80 enemy combatants, all dead. The scene was unlike anything I have witnessed in 3 years of combat. The report describes bodies arranged in patterns, not piled, but posed. Some were seated in circles, staring at the center. Others were standing, propped up against the walls, eyes fixed on the entrance, guarding the darkness that had killed them. Medical examinations later confirmed cause of death. No bullet wounds, no shrapnel, no chemical burns. The official ruling was massive cardiac arrest. Their hearts had simply exploded from the strain of prolonged, absolute terror. But the most terrifying part wasn't the dead. It was the living. By July 1945, as the Pacific War wound down, strange reports began filtering into the field hospitals in the Philippines, where the shadow units were being extracted for debriefing. The military had a problem. The men they had turned into ghosts were not turning back. A classified medical log describes 3 Apache operatives found wandering the perimeter of a base. They weren't injured. They were elsewhere. The log goes, "These men do not respond to their names. They speak in a dialect that no translator can identify. It does not match any known Apache language. When they sleep, their REM cycles are violent, as if they are fighting a war in their dreams. But when they are awake, they are empty. It is as if the shadow they invited in has displaced the man who was there before. The doctors recommended psychiatric care. The colonel recommended isolation. The military realized too late that they had created the ultimate psychological weapon, but they had forgotten to build an off switch. The war was over. But for the shadow warriors, the fear walk never ended. And what the government did next, how they tried to erase these men from history to cover up the cost of their victory, is the darkest chapter of all. August 1945. The bombs have fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The world is celebrating the end of the greatest conflict in human history. But in the Pentagon, a secret committee is meeting to discuss a liability. The Shadow Warrior program had been too successful. They had taken men and surgically removed their humanity, replacing it with a weaponized ancestral darkness. You cannot simply sign a discharge paper and send a ghost back to a reservation to herd sheep. The solution they arrived at was as cold as it was pragmatic. They erased them. Of the 237 men who entered the Box Canyon between 1942 and 1945, only 68 appear in post-war military records. The rest, they vanished. Their families received telegrams citing classified missions or missing in action, but no bodies were ever returned. No graves were ever dug. The few who were processed out were sent to a facility that officially did not exist. Located deep in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of New Mexico, it was designated as a neuropsychiatric rehabilitation center. In 2014, a letter surfaced in a shoebox of family heirlooms in Arizona. It was written by a soldier named Thomas Naish to his brother, dated October 6, 1946. The letter goes, "They tell us we are being cured, but this place is a prison. They give us pills that make the world gray. They ask us to forget the fear walk, but you cannot forget what you have become. We learned to tap into something that was meant to stay buried. We opened a door, brother, and now they are terrified because they cannot close it. If you get a letter saying I died, do not believe it. We do not die easy. Not anymore." Thomas Naich's official death certificate states he died of pneumonia in Albuquerque in November 1946. There is no record of his body ever leaving the mountain. But the program didn't die with Thomas. It just went deeper underground. The Cold War brought new enemies, and the demand for psychological invisible warfare grew. Declassified budget requests from 1948 reveal a project codenamed Night Wind. Recruitment shifted. They stopped asking elders. They started taking young men from the reservations at Nightmen with specific bloodlines. In Korea, Chinese prisoners interrogated by the Marines spoke of the wind that kills. In Vietnam, Special Forces operators in the Central Highlands reported finding entire Viet Cong patrols dead without a mark on them, their faces frozen in rictus masks of absolute terror. And the technology evolved. We found documents from the Army's Chemical Corps dated 1961 detailing Whisper Agent. This wasn't a poison. It was a psychotropic compound designed to induce auditory hallucinations and extreme paranoia. Combined with the Nightbird acoustic devices, a single operative could make an enemy platoon believed they were being hunted by demons. But the most chilling piece of evidence is recent. In 2019, a Department of Defense budget file was briefly uploaded to a public server before being scrubbed. Buried in thousands of lines of code was a single entry for fiscal year 2020. Heritage Warrior Continuation Dollar, $12.3 million. The program is not history. It is current doctrine. Somewhere in the desert Southwest, the training continues. The ghosts are still walking. The war never ended for them. It just changed shadows. This story forces us to ask a question that makes us uncomfortable. What is the price of our safety? We asked these men to become monsters so we could sleep soundly. We asked them to embrace the darkness so we could live in the light. But darkness leaves a stain that does not wash off. The files remain sealed. The graves remain unmarked. And the question remains, when the next war comes and the lights go out, who will be waiting in the dark? The 21st century, the age of drones, satellites, and cyber warfare. You would think the old ways, the knife in the dark, the whisper in the ear, the manipulation of primal fear would be obsolete. You would be wrong. The Shadow War didn't end with the Cold War. It simply evolved. Throughout the last 2 decades of the global war on terror, strange reports have filtered back from the remote valleys of Afghanistan and the ruined cities of Syria. Taliban fighters captured in the Hindu Kush have spoken of a silent death that moves through the mountains, forces that kill without firing a shot, leaving bodies with faces frozen in rictus masks of absolute terror. In 2017, a leak from a Defense Department contractor referenced a program called Heritage Warrior. It wasn't a recruitment drive. It was a budget line item, $12.3 million allocated for unconventional cognitive denial and cultural application. The Apache program never really closed. It just went deeper into the black budget. The children and grandchildren of the original Ghost Walkers are still being recruited. They are taken from the reservations in the middle of the night, promised a chance to serve, and then they disappear into the classified fold. But we must ask, what is the cost? Go to the San Carlos Reservation today. Talk to the elders if they will speak to you. They will tell you about the hollow men who come back. Veterans who stare into the desert for days, who cannot sleep indoors, who speak languages that don't exist. The medicine men try to heal them, to call their spirits back from the dark places they were forced to visit. But some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. We have built a security apparatus on the backs of men we forced to become monsters. We weaponized their heritage, twisted their spirituality into a tool for psychological destruction, and then hid them away when they became inconvenient. The files in the National Archives remain sealed. The unmarked graves in New Mexico remain silent. But the legacy of the Shadow Warriors is all around us. It is in the way modern warfare seeks to break the will before the body. It is in the fear we project to our enemies. But there is a final truth we must face. The Shadow Warrior program succeeded because it tapped into darkness. It proved that fear is a powerful weapon. But it also proved that darkness consumes the wielder just as surely as it consumes the victim. True strength isn't found in the ability to terrify. It isn't found in the power to break a human mind. Real strength, the kind that lasts, the kind that heals rather than destroys, is found in the light. If this story teaches us anything, it is that when we embrace the shadows to win a war, we lose a piece of our soul. The men in this story were asked to become darkness. You have the choice to become something better. The ghosts still walk. But whether they walk into the light or remain in the shadow, that is a question that remains unanswered, waiting in the classified darkness of government vaults and the silent memories of warriors who can never fully return home. The dust of the San Carlos Reservation holds secrets that the Pentagon has tried to bury under 80 years of redactions. If you go there today, if you speak to the elders in the hushed tones they reserve for the old wars, they will not talk about medals or victory parades. They will tell you about the hollow men, These are the veterans who returned from the program, but did not truly come back. There are stories, whispered in families, but never recorded in official histories, of old men who cannot sleep indoors. Men who sit facing the door, tracking movement that no one else can see. Men who speak in languages that do not belong to the Apache, nor to any known dialect on earth tongues learned in the dark, meant to speak to things that live in the shadows. Medicine men have held ceremonies to try to cleanse these warriors, to call their spirits back from the places they were forced to visit. They say the old ways can heal a wounded body, or even a wounded mind. But what was done to these men went deeper. It was a fundamental alteration of the soul. The military took their heritage, weaponized it, and created beings that exist in a twilight state, neither fully belonging to the human world, nor fully to the spirit world. Some of those men are still out there, living in the remote margins of the desert, ghosts in their own lifetime. We leave food for them at the old places. It is gone by morning, but we never see who takes it. In the National Archives, in the deepest classified sections that require a security clearance higher than the president's, there are reportedly entire filing cabinets devoted to the Shadow Warrior program. These files contain letters, personal effects, and photographs of men who officially do not exist. Men who became ghosts by design and remained ghosts by necessity. The question that haunts researchers who have tried to piece together this history is not whether the program was effective. All available evidence suggests it was terrifyingly effective. The question is what we created in the process and whether it can ever be unmade. We asked these men to access parts of human consciousness that most people spend their lives trying to ignore. We gave them tools, chemical, acoustic, psychological, to amplify their presence until they became monsters to our enemies. And then when the treaties were signed and the flags were waved, we expected them to simply turn it off. But you cannot unsee the dark. If you have followed this story to its conclusion, you now carry knowledge it has been deliberately kept from the public for 8 decades. You know about a program that turned men into weapons of psychological warfare. You know about the cost paid by individuals, families, and entire communities so that wars could be won in the shadows. This knowledge comes with a responsibility. The responsibility to remember, to honor those who sacrificed their humanity for our safety, even when that sacrifice cannot be publicly recognized. But beyond the history, beyond the horror, there is a deeper message here. The Shadow Warrior program succeeded because it embraced darkness. It created victory through fear, through the destruction of the mind. It was effective, but it was not righteous. As you reflect on this story, I want to encourage you to look away from the abyss. The men in this story were asked to become the darkness so that we didn't have to. But true strength, the kind that endures, the kind that rebuilds rather than destroys, is found in the light. The files remain sealed. The programs continue. The ghosts still walk. But whether they walk into the light or remain forever in the shadow, that is a question that remains unanswered, waiting in the classified silence of the desert and the memories of warriors who can never fully return home. We end where we began, in the shadows. But before we close the file on Operation Shadow Walker, there is a final truth that must be spoken. It is a truth that goes beyond military strategy, beyond classified budgets, and beyond the history of warfare. The Shadow Warrior program succeeded because it tapped into the darkest parts of the human experience. It was effective because it embraced methods that dehumanized both the enemy and the men we asked to employ them. It created victories, yes, but it created them through the systematic destruction of the human spirit. It was effective, but it was not righteous. As you reflect on this story, on the men who were turned into ghosts, and the price they paid, I want to encourage you to turn toward the light rather than the darkness. There is a wisdom older than the Apache legends, and deeper than the military's psychological profiling, which teaches that real strength comes not from inspiring fear, but from embodying love. That true victory is not found in breaking others, but in lifting them up. In a world that continues to embrace the shadows, you have a choice. The men in this story were ordered to become the darkness. You have the choice to become something better. The files in the vaults may remain sealed. The programs may continue in the black budget ledgers. The ghosts may still walk the high deserts of the Southwest. But whether we allow that darkness to define us, that is the one battle we still have the power to win. Thank you for watching. If you believe these stories need to be told, if you believe that history should not be redacted, help us keep this channel alive. The algorithms try to suppress the truth. Your support is the only thing that brings it to light. Until next time, stay in the light.